Everyone, welcome to this video lecture where we will discuss about the small worlds of creativity and innovation. So in the previous video lectures, we talked about larger structures and larger concepts that influences innovation, inventors, and creativity. So for this lecture, we will be talking about social networks. We will use social network analysis to see how these networks, our personal networks, influences the extent to which we get to innovate and be creative. So the contents of this lecture is based on Ramella's work on chapter 4. So this section begins with the adage 6 degrees of separation. So this means that, when you identify another person, the extent to which you are separated from that person in terms of people within your networks is 6 degrees at the most. So in order to connect A to B, you would have at the most, or you would need at the most 6 people to get in between you, for you to reach person B. So basically, that is where the basis of this section will be. And this section also says that we can exploit that thought, or we can exploit that concept in order to study the likelihood of innovations. And therefore, this section begins with the scientific study of social networks. So there will be a lot of math, but we will not really immerse ourselves into the math. We will talk about more of the application of the things that we learned from the mathematical findings in relation to networks, specifically real-world networks, and also their applications in social networks. And basically, as sociologists, we should be able to understand that there are different social and political factors that influences the extent to which we are able to reach the right people through appropriate channels, right? So the extent to which we are far from our target person to collaborate with, or the target person that we need information from, is based on our social and political influence. So for instance, you are a famous person or you are an influencer, then maybe it would be easier for you to reach out for a person that you need regardless of whether you know them personally or not, compared to a person who's relatively not so famous, probably doesn't have a high position in society, not very influential. It will be quite harder for that person to be able to reach the person that he wants to reach or they want to reach. But like we said, it's not impossible, and the maximum number of nodes that we need in order for us to reach that person is 6 degrees and probably littler. And there is the argument that acquaintances that we have, or our acquaintances networks, are actually socially structured and not random, meaning maybe our mutual friends are not mutual, our mutual friends are not randomly just popping up. There is a structure to which mutual friends or mutual acquaintances come up in our social network. We just don't realize it, probably because we don't really look at our social network. And when I say social network, this is not just social network from our social media sites, although that's the best way to understand it. But social networks can also be our real life face-to-face networks. So basically, the argument is the more acquaintances you know, the more likely you'll be able to innovate. Remember the weak ties understanding of Granovetter? So that's very important in innovation, the number of acquaintances that you have. And acquaintances like we have are more likely, when you put maths on it and when you analyze it very deeply, they actually form structures or social structures, networks that can be predicted in terms of behavior and in terms of nature, right? Now, the extent to which we get to accumulate acquaintance networks is based on different social structures. So, for example, your territory. So, there are certain places wherein communities are more tightly packed. So, therefore, you have more acquaintances. And geographical proximity of one person to another. So, physical environment is one of the features that can influence the extent to which we get to accumulate acquaintances. Of course, you have your kinship and family relations, right? So your work world, there's a possibility to connect your work world with the work world of your mother and the work world of your father, right? So for example, there is a person that you need, and your mother is a colleague of that person that you need, so you can actually attach yourself to that. And of course, our kinship networks in its own in their own are already very robust. You know, you can meet so many people within your family. Although we will explain later why it's easier for innovations to flourish within acquaintance networks compared to family and friendly networks, right? And of course, you have your leisure and elective relationships. So example of your elective relationships would be probably the school organizations that you get into. You will build a lot of acquaintance networks there, right? And of course, your leisure, no? So probably you go to the gym, so you have probably know people in the gym. I sometimes go to the gym, and I really don't befriend people there, but the sense that in the future, if I need someone from them, at least I see them, at least I'm acquainted with them, even in a very non-communicative way, you know. So you can build acquaintance networks from the sports that you engage in, you know. You can also have probably a lot of acquaintance networks within your K-pop fan bases, right? So yeah, so the each social group that you engage yourself in, your achieve social statuses also means that you can increase your acquaintance network, you know. And of course, another way of looking at this acquaintance network would be increasing your social capital. But of course, social capital has of course we are also conversing that in a way. We get into that conversation in such a way that it increases, you know, our life outcomes. But in terms of thinking about specifically innovations, while social networks mean social capital, innovation really goes more into social networks as a perspective. So the small world phenomenon, or the experiment that kind of demonstrated the idea of it's a small world after all, you know, when you meet someone and you find out that you both know the same person, and you kind of exclaim, oh my gosh, small world, is the social psychologist and experimenter Stanley Milgram. He devised the experiment that was conducted in 1967, which they call the Harvard approach to social networks. So they asked the question, what was the probability that any two people arbitrarily chosen from a large population, such as that of the United States, would know each other? And assuming that they didn't know each other, how many intermediaries would be required to put them in touch? So basically, to answer these questions, the two scholars organized an experiment that was quite simple, but basically made sense in terms of testing that small world idea. So they identified person A, you know, or the starter participant, and the target participant. So the target participant should not be known to the starter participant. And basically, the experimenters told the starter participants, you have to make sure that this envelope or this mail should get to the target participant. But the target participant is not known to the starter participant. So they have to devise a plan, the starter part, to be able to send it to that person. And it could be, they could exhaust their social networks, they could exhaust the people that they know, ask around, you know, and see how they will be able to reach that person. And eventually, most of the participants that they assigned as starters were able to get to the target participants. And actually, the 6 degrees of separation was really solidified because that was kind of the average number of people they need to be in between them. There's a number of intermediaries that they need in order for them to get to the target participant. So that's the reason why the 6 degrees of separation was kind of introduced. So in trying to establish the small world phenomenon, Milgram argued that it is social and not physical distance that kind of separates us apart, you know. Meaning, especially probably in this globalized world, you can actually meet someone, and it's actually the extent of the robustness of your social networks that makes it more possible for you to reach that person, and not because that person is living very far away from you. So it is actually social distance that restricts us or facilitates the extent to which we can be able to connect to another person. And then another insight that they were able to gain here is that there were two ways that we try to find a person that we want to connect to. It's either we find it through our professional chains, probably within our world of work or within our school, or it could also be through territorial chains. Maybe someone, for example, do you know this someone who also works at the same occupation or is also someone in the same profession? Or you can actually go to, this person that I want to look to is also living in the place where you are. Do you probably know this person? So it's either, in terms of trying to look for a person that you want to connect to, it's either from your professional, from looking at the professional background of the person, or the territorial background of the person. And also, they were able to find out that we would mostly ask persons within our chains within the same gender. Meaning, if I was male, I would most likely ask persons who are also male to reach to that person I want to reach. And then same goes with the females based on the experiment. Now, this was kind of replicated. This experiment was replicated in the Millennium male experiment. It was done in Columbia University in 2003. Remember, during this time, there's already internet and we're kind of more connected, and there's already the birth of email. So they identified 18 target people from all over the world, and it was the number of starter people who they included were 61,000, and they come from 166 nations. So this is a global experiment. So what was found out is that, yes, most of the starter people were able to reach the target people that they didn't know based just by using the emails. Now, according also to the findings that they would ask the help of, or they would choose intermediaries who are close friends and those who were quite close friends. Also, they chose to look for that person through their professional networks. I guess one of the reasons why they opted for professional networks because this was an email communication, and usually during that time, emails were mostly very formal. And one very important insights that they were able to get was that while people preferred strong ties, people that they had strong ties to as possible intermediaries towards the person that they targeted, but it showed that when they choose people with weaker ties, like acquaintances, to hook them up with the person that they're targeting, it's more successful than those who sought for the help of stronger ties. And it kind of agrees with the argument of Granovetter that says that mostly, success in innovation happens between people with weaker ties. And we'll explain a little bit about why that is later. So, in performing a social search, meaning finding a person that we can possibly get information from, finding a person that will be able to help us accomplish a certain goal, or finding a person that we will possibly be able to collaborate with or innovate with. This newer experiment saw that the separation is actually 5 circles of acquaintances. All right? So, not very far from the 6 degrees of separation. And so, it was also found out here, or it was another insight here is that there is a contention of who would most likely be better in terms of getting us to our goals in terms of the social search. Is it our friends and relatives or our acquaintances? And actually, it was said here that acquaintances were more likely the persons to get us to our target persons. because they provide us with non-redundant information. Because our acquaintances do not necessarily have the same social exposures as us. Compared to our family and friends, no? We share the same knowledge, we share the same values, we share the same aspirations, we share the same profession. So when you converse with them or interact with them instrumentally, the tendency is that you will just be replicating the ideas that you already know, because you have the same social exposures, compared to acquaintances that you do not meet so often and you do not work with so often. Probably has this different social background as you have, probably has a different social exposure than you have. Probably you're not having a very emotional relationship with that person, but there's an increased likelihood for you to be able to forge new ideas with that person because you belong to different social backgrounds, so that you will be able to see new ideas, because they are providing their social backgrounds to you and your social background to them. So it is through acquaintances that we get more non-redundant information, and non-redundant information is what is needed for us to innovate. Remember our previous discussions. Usually our innovation is not really like an idea that comes from nothing. No, usually these are old ideas that we restructure, that we combine together, that we recontextualize, and that is what makes it new. That is what makes it innovative. And so when two people who are acquaintances or have weaker ties than that, they bring in their own knowledge, their own social background, and the acquaintance bring in their own knowledge, their own social background. When you interact with each other, there's a highly likelihood that you'll be able to have a diversity of information, and that diversity of ideas will most likely form into new, more developed ideas that can forge innovation. Thus, Granovetter weak ties. But you need to exert some form of effort. Transmission along the chain of that intermediaries looking for that specific person that you're searching for, it's difficult. At least probably during the time that Ramella was thinking of all these things. Of course now, because of the internet, it's a little bit easier. But again, if you want to search for a person, you really need to, exert some effort. You need to be motivated to search for a person in order for you to search a person that is outside your circle, right? So this is motivational. And for someone who has a little bit of social anxiety, as I am, it kind of struck some nerve to me. But yeah, but I do agree. If I want to meet a new person, if I want to meet a target person, I should be motivated enough, to look for him or for her on the internet, and try to see how I'll be able to connect with that person through my mutual friends, or acquaintances, or whatever. So that's why social networks is such a very important thing if you wanna innovate. But Burt argues that, let's look for weak ties, but not too weak. Because, we want to have some form of salience in that relationship, because we don't want, we make sure that there should be a follow through. Like, for example, if you are going to ask about someone through an acquaintance, the acquaintance should have some form of allegiance to you, regardless of how weak that allegiance is, so that they would come back to you and inform you about that, and then they really accomplish the task, right? Because I have that social anxiety sometimes. If I ask a favor from an acquaintance, what is the extent that that acquaintance would most likely really provide me with that information? So the ties with the person that we want to be, that we want to work with, or we want to be our transmitter towards the person that we're targeting, should be weak but not so weak, according to Burt. And it's all about having information and control. Meaning, the advantages of getting to an acquaintance or getting to a target person through acquaintances is getting new information. But also, it has something to do with the extent to which you get to control, that person, and be able to really to be able to get your goal from that person. So accessing new information is all about timeliness. So you should be able to, when you want to connect with a person, that person you should catch that person during the time wherein they're more likely welcoming to help you. And during the time of COVID, it's quite difficult to be able to really pin down on that person, on a certain person, and allow that person to give some time to you. And also, we have to check on the legitimacy, credibility, and reliability of the acquaintances passing the information. And this is sometimes as a researcher, looking at novel things, this is something that I'm also quite very wary about and very skeptical about and very meticulous about. For example, if I want to be able to access a possible collaborator for a research, and that collaborator is within my social network but is not directly related to me, and I have to inform someone else about my idea so that that person can bring that idea to my target person. There's always that concern that I have to make sure that the intermediary is someone I trust, someone who may not be necessarily my friend or a professional link or an acquaintance, or maybe just an acquaintance, would be loyal enough and trustworthy enough and truthful enough to not steal my ideas. And that's also the same thinking that organizations have when they try to tie up with another organizations. They have to have some form of control over the information that they're providing on other organizations, because they only just want to give enough information to be able to spark that idea making, but not so much ideas until papers are written down and signed so that you can protect your information from competitors. Right? So legitimacy, credibility, and reliability of acquaintances and networks passing that information is very, very important as well to safeguard the innovative ideas that we have. So at this juncture, I want you to pause the video first and then go below this video and then click the first link, or copy the link and open it in a new tab and watch that video to be able to understand how the small worlds phenomenon that was demonstrated by Milgram eventually was able to inform network science, right? And how it was able to see that the small world networks actually patterned a lot of networks that are found in real world across realities and disciplines. So this can be networks of nodes, networks of neurons, networks of people, etc., etc. So watch that video and then come back here after. So based on that video you watched, it is some of the implications that we were able to find in terms of the real world networks or the small world networks that we find in the real world is that small world networks are numerically large, meaning there are a lot of nodes that are connected to us, especially in the social worlds, especially in the era of social media and the internet. Next, it's also globally sparse, meaning it's, you have a lot of friends that don't know each other, For example, and sometimes, there is an intention that to keep it that way, but sometimes they spill over. Like, for example, I have a small group or a group, I have a group or I have friends from the performing arts. I have my family members. I have my colleagues from my previous school, my colleagues in my current school. And while they're all connected to me, I'm the central node. They're sparse. Most of them don't know each other. So something like that. Okay, so our world is, so those nodes that happen in real world are globally sparse. They can really reach to a lot of lengths and they don't really have to connect to each other, right? But who knows? We don't know that maybe they really know each other. So that's what the network analysis is for, to be able to see whether or not those people that we don't that are connected to us, that we're not sure they're connected to each other. Network studies will be able to study that kind of behavior of networks. And usually they're decentralized. Although in network studies, we try to find a lot of nodes, that where we find most of the centers. There are a lot of centers. So, ibig sabihin, while there are main nodes where most of the outer nodes are found, usually they're not just singular nodes. And they're locally and highly clustered. Meaning, yun nga, for example, in my case, I have a performing, I am connected to the networks of performing artists. I am connected to my professional colleagues here at LaSalle. I have my colleagues from my previous school. And then I have my friends from high school. I have friends from college. And they're highly clustered among their own. So they know each other. And then there are possibilities though that you might have spillovers across these clusters. But the clusters, the friends in a specific area of my life, they're more likely going to be clustered. Okay. Now, in the chapter on, or in the section on scale-invariant networks, there's a lot of math there, but we will not really delve into the math, because there won't even be chances for us to be able to demonstrate that, because we don't have the computer applications that they used it in. So we will just jump into so what are the characteristics of scale-invariant networks? Scale-invariant networks are networks that do not necessarily possess a typical scale, meaning networks usually are predictably unpredictable, if I may say. So I think that's the most layman way that we can explain it. So in terms of characteristics of scale-invariant networks of social reality, what can we learn from them, and how can that be applied to innovativeness? So first, we know that real-world networks, excluding social worlds, are dynamic systems. They change over time. So, and mostly, especially for social worlds, they usually change, and they actually increase and diversify. Okay? And what separates other real-world networks, like for example, biological networks that you can find in information sciences or other forms of networks, are and how it's different from social networks is that they're variable and contingent. And the variability of the networks that we have are conditioned by different social institutional structures, like our religious groups, our religious affiliation, our educational affiliations, our work affiliations, our family, the culture that we belong to, the region that we are living in. So this influences our social networks. And Kleinberg also argues that unlike other forms of real-world networks that are found in other disciplines, social networks are composed of nodes that are not just nodes that you find in a computer, that are graphed in a computer. These nodes are equipped with social identities. So the behavior of the nodes cannot be, equated to the nodes that you find in, information technology, or the way cells interact with each other or chemicals interact with each other, because social identities are highly contextualized, and we are super nuanced, and our behaviors can be predicted, but it's kind of chaotic because there are a lot of internal factors within us, our psychological and biological factors that influence us, our behavior as a node in that system, and also our external factors, our immediate social groups, the social institutions that we belong to, and the different social discourses that influence our values and our beliefs and other taken for grantedness. So I think that was what Kleinberg is saying. So while social networks behave similarly to any other form of network, therefore network scientists can look at social networks, and usually in computer sciences, I have friends from the computer sciences, and they usually understand, and like for example, how are we able to say that this specific account is a troll? we are able to understand that through network sciences. Because if they don't be, if the networks attached to that account do not behave the way they behave in real world networks, the biggest possibility is that it's either that thing is a troll or that thing is passing on in misinformation. Because there are some behaviors that we already expect. But even if we have tenets like that, we have to understand that understanding those types of predictable behaviors are nuanced by different social contexts because the nodes in the social world have social identities. And, you know, when we try to build connections, social connections, usually we kind of, you know, we tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to us. It's easier to make a connection with people who are the same sex, probably same social status, same degree program, you know, same neighborhood, same church, you know. However, in terms of building social networks, homophily, or the tendency for us to gravitate towards people that we have similarities to, kind of also restricts our individual social world. Because, you know, the tendency is that, you know, if the only persons that I mingle with are professional artists, then I would most likely just, you know, restrict my social world to performing artists. You know, so, and again, the more restricted your social world is, the less likely that you will be able to expose to new ideas. But it's an innovation, right? So, it's important that when we try to expand our social networks, if we want to be able to think of new things, if we want to innovate, then be increasing your social networks, meeting different people, ensuring diversity in your organization is very, very important, right? So it means the more multidimensional our relationships are, when we try to penetrate as many social groups as we can, it renders our global world small. Ibig sabihin, more people become accessible to us when we expand our social networks across different clusters. And of course, making the global world small increases the likelihood of innovating with other people. Now, how can we use this idea that we have in terms of the behavior of social networks in sociology? So, two things. One is when we try to study about diffusion of innovations, right? So, how do we know that a certain idea can reach as many people as we can? We can use social network for that. Also, infection, right? We also make use of social networks to be able to predict how many people might be infected, you know, once a person is exposed. No? So that is one way of looking at it. So diffusion of anything, information, infection, innovation, etc. And then also search, no, the extent to which we are able to our behaviors to be able to search for new people, like the Stanley Milgram experiment. So that is how we can use the lens of sociology in studying social networks. Social network studies are not only for sociology, but for other, like for example, communication sciences or political science, etc. Now, let's go to more intimate networks. Intimate, not emotional, but intimate, but small, you know? So, let's go to affiliation networks, or usually called bimodal or bipartite networks, wherein we just, you know, have a small people with a similar goal. And this is common in scientific communities. You know, for example, affiliation is within who we collaborate with in our research works, right? Or our affiliation with the school or the department that we're in. And generally, we have a common goal. And but despite that, we have we are compelled to get to generate new ideas as well. And these small affiliation networks can also be seen in the phenomenon that is increasing in terms of the interlocking directorates, meaning board of directors of different firms are common across different corporations or across different organizations. So you will be able to find, like, for example, when we talk about, I will talk about, my previous university, and most of the time, the board of directors who are part of the school, well, of course, they are from from the same congregation of sisters. So you would find that in terms of board of directors, you would find the same board members who are sisters within that congregation. Probably the president of school A would be a board member of school B, etc., etc. But also, you will find that this same sisters may also be board members of hospitals that they manage or they own, or sometimes hospitals that just believe in their strategic viewpoints, right? So you'll be able, and in our social reality now, in the world that we have now, we see that certain organizations would tend to share, to have board members that are shared across different organizations. And this goes back in terms of having more control over the information that, runs a specific company. And also the possibility of collaboration among those organizations, correct? So, therefore, there's what we call a contamination between organization, especially now there is that phenomenon of buying organization, or buying the organization of your competitors. Like, for example, when you remember Jollibee, they bought Red Ribbon, and now they also bought Mang Inasal. So the competition, they usually buy the competition so that they will be able to benefit across without really having that real decreasing that competition now. So that, and of course the ideas will also contaminate across those organizations. So the innovation in A will also breed a different on innovation in B, but they're coming from the same board member. Thus, the increasing rise of corporate elite and shareholder capitalism. We see the same persons running the same organizations, and therefore decreasing the competitiveness, right? Thus, oligarchy, etc., etc. Ramella then moves to a section that presents an empirical research by Uzzi and Spiro on the Broadway musicals industry, and they were able to kind of present the idea of a small world quotient that puts the factors of connectivity, the extent to which the number of relationships that the actors in, when we say actors, not just the Broadway actors, but all of the actors in the Broadway musical, like musicians, composers, dancers, actors, etc. And also the cohesion, the extent to which the quality of their relationships. So, the extent to which the small world influences the outcomes of a Broadway musical and the actors that play in them is first structural. This means there is a good relations between different clusters. So when we say a cluster is, let's say, one musical, and as we know, sometimes one director will work with certain actors in this given in musical A, and then after that musical has closed, director B will go to a different musical and probably have the same actor. So whatever they have learned, or that director has learned from the previous musical, they can use those ideas to improve the new musical that he's working in. So And that basically, that ability, so the extent to which certain actors in the Broadway musical scene get to interact with different actors through these different musicals would most likely have the innovative ideas because they circulate non-redundant information compared to, you're a director and these are the only actors that I want to be working with. So the tendency is that your ideas will be staler, no? So it's important to have relations between these clusters of people. But also, you have to look at the relational component, which is the cohesion that increases links between the actors in the Broadway musical. Not just actors, but, all of the people who are involved in the Broadway musical. Right? So, of course, when you have good relationships, then there is also that the high likelihood of you having more creativity to put into that stage production. So in short, innovation is fostered when there is good local cohesion, meaning the clusters are well knit, and there's global connectivity when these clusters are connected to each other. And then there are those research in relation to strategic alliances and patent partnerships. So in terms of organizations who work together to be able to apply for patents for their innovation. So first insight is that strategic alliances are strongly clustered, meaning there is a limited amount of organizations that organizations partner with, right? And they are united by cooperation agreements that are formal. Now, in terms of developing new ideas within an organization and across organization, the insights that were brought by the research is that small teams would work better in terms of cohesion. But this team should be not overly cohesive to the extent that members could not challenge each other's ideas. No, it is in the challenging of ideas that we get innovative production, so that you will not have groupthink. Now, over time, the local cluster cohesion remains unaltered, meaning most organizations that are innovative still work in small teams, but the global network connectivity narrows, meaning there are less and lesser organizations that are partnering because, again, the protection of the information. One example of that is in-your-face innovation and also the territorial social networks that kind of foster technological innovation is Silicon Valley. So before, I want you to pause first after this part. I want you to watch the video, the second link in the description, and then go back after watching the short introduction on Silicon Valley. And now, since you've seen already sa video the background and the history of Silicon Valley, you know now why technological innovations are booming there. It's because of the networks of different actors that are closely knit but are also globally connected, meaning their connections with other industries, right? And the production of new companies are also attached to this network. That is the reason why it became a hub of technology. So these are the functions of Silicon Valley on organizations that are innovative. One, they finance technological startups. And those who want to have their innovative products be out into the mainstream, Silicon Valley also provides capital through the venture capital firms. And your work there as an innovator is to be able to convince venture capital that yours is a startup that will be worth investing on. And then also, since Silicon Valley has already made its reputation to the world as a technological hub, they are able to also signal the best startup and kind of already market you, give you a head start, you know, so that it's easier for you to diffuse whatever innovation you've made. Next is Silicon Valley also embeds new companies to existing ones, no? And also, Silicon Valley is a place for collective learning across all of these companies, right? So that's the role of Silicon Valley and why it is such a haven for technological innovation. So in this video, we learned that it's a small world after all, and that the level of cohesion that we have within our clusters of social networks and the extent to which we are globally connected to these social networks increases our capacities to be innovative, whether we're talking of it as an individual actor, tayo, or organizations.